All right, so welcome to your first stats video. We're going to be going over section 1.1. So the main topics in chapter 1 altogether are describing what data are, how do we collect it, how do we store it, and then how do we interpret it. So first, there's two major concepts in statistics that we need to talk about. One is variation, which is how observations differ. Okay, and the other one is data. Now what data is it's recorded observations. All right, so to give us an idea, let's go ahead and draw 4 circles, and let's try to make them as close as we can. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Nailed it. Those are obviously beautiful. Okay, and when we talk about how are they the same and how are they different, and how would we measure these, it's not enough to say, like, this circle here is a better circle than this one in the bottom right-hand corner. We have to talk about how you would measure it. So one of the ways that we can measure how these circles are different or the same is by looking at their diameter or looking at their radius. And there's a couple of other things we could do. We could measure one's area to the rest. And we could also look at where their tails overlap. So we could also look at tails. So when I say tails, what I'm talking about is these guys right here. Okay, so it's not enough to say that something is the same or to say that something is different. What we want to say is, how do you measure it? So that's what the rest of the, basically the entire term is going to be talking about. So for this next example, let's say that our friend comes up to us and she says that she got 76 points on an exam. So let's think of what additional information we want to know in order to determine how well or poorly she did. So we want to know some additional information so that we can be good friends and react appropriately. So one thing that we might want to know is what the minimum and maximum possible scores were. Possible scores. We also want to know what the minimum and maximum actual scores were. So for an exam, typically the minimum score would be a 0, but rarely does somebody actually get a 0 on an exam. The other thing we might want to know is what the average score was. So maybe if this was a typical exam that was out of, let's say, 100 points and she got a 76, we might say that she did pretty okay, right? She got a C. However, if the average score out of 100 was a 60, then she actually did pretty well. Okay? Good. And the other thing we might want to do is, maybe we're not interested in comparing her to others, but maybe her previous exam scores. Okay. Great. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about is something called variation. So both exam A and exam B are going to have the same average score of 75%. But if we actually look at the raw data below, we can tell that these were very different exams. So for example, exam A had scores that range from the low or mid, or from the mid 50s and 60s to the high 90s, and even somebody got some extra credit. However, on exam B, we can see that most of the scores hovered around 70 to 80%. So we had a couple 75, 74s. So how we would describe the difference between these, and in later sections we'll actually get a numerical method, is we say that this exam had more variation. Had more variation. And we would say this one had less variation. Now, another word that we could use instead of variation is we can also use the word spread. So this one would have more variation or a greater spread. Great. Now what we're ready to do is move on to the next section.